In this episode, we discuss graphic examples of violence against women. Listener discretion is advised.
It's a very disturbing story which is coming in from Kota. In fact, a student there has been gang raped. 4 people have been arrested.
Another murder horror in Bengaluru. Techie kills live-in girlfriend in Bengaluru. Techie allegedly hung partner. And this is a shocker coming in from Prayagraj in Uttar Pradesh. Shocking molestation caught on camera. A woman was molested and the act was filmed.
A 4-year-old woman has been allegedly raped in Pakistan's capital, Islamabad.
Today, I want to ask possibly the most important question of all. Why is there so much violence against women? Is it really just our bad luck, being at the wrong place at the wrong time? Is it always a woman's fault? The way she dresses, the way she looks, the way she acts? My name is Shana. Welcome to Her Kajal Won't Smudge. To look at this question of violence against women, I reached out to Kate Mann, whose research shows that the violence against women is not random.
If you think of misogyny as the police force of patriarchy, then I think the way to think about sexism is the kind of bad science of patriarchy. So in a slogan, one way to put it is that sexism wears a lab coat and misogyny goes on witch hunts.
Kate is a philosopher, an associate professor at Cornell University, and she's been called the Simone de Beauvoir of our times. She's the author of 2 best-selling books, Down Girl and Entitled. I also wanted Kate to consider not only talking about her work, but actually applying it to the South Asian context. To do this, Kate suggested that we bring on Urna Chakraborty, a graduate student in Kate's department whose research looks at Brahminical patriarchy, amongst other topics.
Caste norms, they have a great deal to do with, say, norms of female chastity, who gets to work outside the home, who doesn't, what it means to provide based on the caste location that a woman is coming from. As we'll see, I think, later in the podcast, there's different ways that giving is construed in a context that is encasted, as the Desi context is.
So today, I'm thrilled to be in conversation with Kate and Urna to apply Kate's framework to India and ask the question, why is there so much violence against women? Kate and Urna, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for having us, Shana.
Great. So, Kate, you've written 3 books, Down Girl, Entitled, and Unshrinking. I won't ask about Unshrinking as I don't think it's out yet. But in Down Girl, you look at what you call the logic of misogyny. Could you begin by telling us what is misogyny?
Sure. So I think of misogyny as metaphorically the police force of patriarchy. I think of misogyny as that which punishes, polices, and controls girls and women, and tries to get girls and women to fall in line with patriarchal norms and expectations. So I see it as a punitive force and a hostile one which girls and women face that is designed as a matter of its internal logic to get women and girls to stay in their lane, fall in line, and know their place.
And how does sexism fit into that?
Yeah, so if you think of misogyny as the police force of patriarchy, then I think the way to think about sexism is the kind of bad science of patriarchy. So in a slogan, one way to put it is that sexism wears a lab coat and misogyny goes on witch hunts. So to unpack that a little bit, sexism is the wing of patriarchy that kind of theorizes gender and says that girls and women are quote unquote naturally well suited to playing caregiving roles, to extending to cis and usually straight men roles like emotional, reproductive, as well as sexual and material labor. So sexism says that men are naturally well suited to play roles that are traditionally masculine coded, things like leadership positions in everything from business to politics to academia to sports, and that girls and women are naturally suited to play a kind of superficially complementary role within the domestic sphere, and also doing forms of labor that involve sex, care, love, and attention.
In your second book, you look at male entitlement. Can you elaborate why you wanted to look at this and how it interacts with misogyny?
If we're thinking of sexism as this kind of bad, debunked, and as we now know, false scientific view about some kind of difference in the natures of men and women and boys and girls, and we're thinking about misogyny as enforcing patriarchal social roles, we can see that there'll often be a sense of women and girls being obligated to give men certain kinds of goods within a patriarchy, goods like sex and love and attention and care. And then what often happens with that sense of obligation is a sense of entitlement on the flip side. So in a way, the mirror image of a sense of obligation that women and girls are obligated to play these social roles, again, with attention to their kind of intersectional dimensions, will be that men are entitled, especially privileged, and again, cis, straight, and often in the American context, white men. There'll be a sense that they're entitled to receive women's love, nurturing, and emotional and sexual labor, as well as their reproductive labor. So it's a whole false moral system.
Right, of give and take.
Yes, women being the proverbial human givers in this framework, and men being the ones who take in terms of what is socially sanctioned and permitted by, again, the norms of patriarchy.
So the word misogynist, when Trump was in office, I heard that word used to describe him many times. And when I Googled the word misogynist, while I was reading Down Girl, I found a definition which is a person who dislikes, despises, or is strongly prejudiced against women. One of the things I remember reading is that you've made the point that if Trump is a misogynist, then as soon as he says that he loves his wife or his mother, then the definition of misogyny falls apart. Could you elaborate on that for us?
Look, I think of misogynists as just being, if you like, overachievers in the misogyny system, as being people, typically, but not necessarily men, who practice a lot of what I think of as misogyny, who are overactive, that is more active than average by a good proportion, in policing and punishing girls and women who don't toe the line. And these men can be perfectly approving to quote unquote good women, loving wives, devoted mothers, loyal secretaries. A man like Trump is a good example of this. He really has no problem with women who are faithfully subordinate to him and who, do his bidding, who serve him. Why would men have a problem with women of this nature? So it's not a universal dislike or hatred towards any and every woman, but rather hating specific women who they don't perceive as being, sufficiently good, loyal, devoted, and playing their allotted role within a patriarchy, which certainly Trump was massively guilty of that, and thus deserves to be called a misogynist, despite not hating every woman.
So if misogyny doesn't arise from a man's personal psychology, meaning like what he thinks of a particular woman, then where does it come from?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not a historian, and so I don't feel as a philosopher that I have a particularly authoritative answer on this, and there may be a more sophisticated answer to be had, but one way of looking at this is that patriarchy is a very old system of oppression, and, I'm sure Erna can speak to this more as well, but patriarchy is about as old as agriculture. And so whenever you have a patriarchy, you have this system which is really going to need a certain amount of policing and enforcing in order for people to play their allotted gender roles. And so a simple way of putting it is that you need a police force because sexism is a false theory. It's just not true that even generally women will be particularly interested in or well suited to playing these nurturing, attentive, loving caregiver roles. I mean, the empirical evidence on this is quite clear that that is false even as a generalization. And so you kind of need the police force then to kick in and say, I will punish you if you don't play these roles to girls and women.
So one of the things I find so interesting about your framework is that you talk about misogyny having a logic, and you mentioned that, you know, if a man has been raised to believe that a woman is a human giver and she's supposed to provide comfort and emotional support, and if a woman, for example, rejects a man's proposal for marriage or to enter into a relationship, then in his mind, using violence or stalking or trolling, policing a woman makes sense in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And this I found so eye-opening for me because it suggests that the violence women face is not just random acts, but that there is something much more systematic at play here.
Thanks, Shana. That's a really good way of putting it. I mean, one image that has stuck with me in working on this material is an image of an entitled diner who is kind of sitting at a restaurant and who has been taught to expect that his waitress will come serve him, who will come bring him delicious food, and who will be doing it with a smile, moreover, you know, subordination with a smile in a nutshell. And then, you know, maybe his food doesn't turn up. Maybe his waitress is nowhere to be found. You can imagine that diner, even though he shouldn't, but you can imagine him understandably-ish, although, you know, this isn't to at all justify it, but he may become frustrated and resentful. He may even end up banging his spoon on the table. He might explode in frustration. So, in other words, when you set up a class of people to expect too much and give them the sense that they're the entitled patrons in a kind of system designed to serve them, then when things change and when things become more egalitarian, you know, now maybe it's expected that everyone will get their own food. Maybe it's expected everyone will have a role in preparing the food and cleaning up as well as, you know, just eating it. Maybe we'll see girls and women, not just in server roles, but also sitting down to have their own meals. You can imagine that someone might react rather badly to that egalitarian and, you know, much more just state of affairs, but one that doesn't serve him as handsomely.
Urna, I'd like you to elaborate on this a little bit from a South Asian lens, because, you know, in Desi society, we have so many social norms around who are the good girls, the good wives, the good mothers, and kind of underpinning all of these is this concept of the emotional labor that women are supposed to be human givers. So I'd like to kind of get your take on that.
Yeah, I feel like Kate's analysis of misogyny as enforcing the patriarchal requirement that women be human givers is just so on point when you look at how there's ideas that have religious and social sanction in the Desi context requiring women to be dutiful, right? Dutiful daughters, dutiful wives, mothers, daughters-in-law. And it's just that there's multiple factors that coincide in the Desi context to develop these requirements. Caste norms, they have a great deal to do with, say, norms of female chastity, who gets to work outside the home, who doesn't, what it means to provide based on the caste location that a woman is coming from. As we'll see, I think, later in the podcast, there's different ways that giving is construed in a context that is encasted, as the Desi context is.
If we can, I'd like us to take a look at some specific examples of crimes and control in India. And I'd like to ask both of you to help us apply the framework to see what insights we might have if we take the view that the violence against women isn't just random acts that happen, you know, by some crazed or depraved men, but if we take the view that there is, in fact, a system of patriarchy that results in women being the subject of so much violence. I'd like to start with acid attacks. So I have gone on to Google, and on more than one occasion, I've looked at acid attack stories. And this is from the Acid Survivors Foundation website. And they had a story about a woman named Rupali. And her story is like so many other stories. So Rupali is 14 years old. She refused her cousin's marriage proposal, and then the cousin threw acid on her face, and she was shamed by her community. If we were to apply the framework here, what do we learn about acid attacks that we didn't know before? Acid attacks ruin lives. Women are ostracized by their communities, and they're expected to live with the shame as if it was all their fault. The numbers I'm about to share are considered to be a tip of the iceberg, as most of these attacks go unreported. Between 1999 and 2021, Bangladesh recorded almost 4,000 cases of acid attacks. Similarly, Pakistan recorded about 1,200 cases between 2007 and 2015. In India, in just 2 years, between 2018 and 2020, there were almost 700 cases of acid attacks. And in all three countries, the overwhelming majority of the victims were female.
I think one piece of research that I found really striking in this regard when I was looking at acid attacks in India and Bangladesh, among other places, I think, the very same happens in the United States as well. But the reports that I read say that the most common reasons for the attack have been found to be the refusal of marriage, the denial of sex, and the rejection of romance. So it's very much striking to me that the apparently most common reasons for such abhorrent and heart-wrenching attacks on a woman or girl are a sense of entitlement having been dashed, a sense of expectation having gone unsatisfied.
And if I may jump in, I'm not going to explicitly bring in caste here, but I found Kate's very powerful line in Down Girl where she says, misogynist violence is usually a result of the withholding of feminine-coded goods from a man that he felt entitled to and the taking away of masculine-coded goods from that man. And so if we take that little dictum and divide it into two, well, then the feminine-coded goods that the perpetrator of an acid attack may have felt entitled to include the woman's hand in marriage, monopoly over her reproductive and productive labor, her romantic care and emotional support, and then the masculine-coded goods that are taken away from the perpetrator may include things like, when he feels aggrieved at the rejection, he may feel that he has lost face as a result of it. And so insofar as men are to be obeyed and their demands fulfilled, misogynist violence stems from such feelings of being aggrieved.
I'd like to look at sexual harassment and trolling. So it's a really big problem. Both of these are big problems all over the world. In India and Pakistan, for women on the streets, it's an everyday occurrence, right? Getting ogled, brushed up against, men masturbating in front of women. And then with trolling, women who are online, men will call them sluts and whores, and they'll be very personal in their attacks. They'll call out body shape, skin color, facial features, anything really, as a way to get a dig at a woman. What does the framework help us understand about what's going on here?
I think in the US context, where I'd be curious if anything you would think is different here, Aruna, but my sense is that a lot of these attacks and forms of sexual harassment and street harassment, similarly catcalling, they're ways of showing dominance. They're very clear ways of announcing a kind of dominance where I get to display myself and objectify you, not because I actually think that you are an object in terms of lacking mental states, but because your mental states and your discomfort don't matter, that I should be able to look at you in whatever ways that I deem, fun for me and rate you and rank you in comparison with other girls and women. And that I have the kind of right, again, this sense of entitlement to preside over the value, the social and sexual value of girls and women at large.
I totally agree with that. And I also think that there's this notion that women who dare to be out in public are quote unquote fair game. And that's especially prominent in India, and caste plays a huge role in this dynamic insofar as historically, it has been the case that women from marginalized castes have historically had to work jobs outside the home as domestic help, cleaners, traders, masons, foragers, etc. While usually it was upper caste women who were generally confined to their homes, not allowed to work, etc. So, insofar as the bodies of caste marginalized women have been subject to such kinds of violence for a long, long time, now that more women from different, more privileged castes are stepping out onto the street and onto, say, online platforms, which is another way of being in public, it follows, I think, that that sort of violence would be visited upon them as well. Different flavor, of course. The flavor of entitlement is completely different, and the kind of domination, it has a completely different logic. But there's a similarity there, I think, stepping out in public and what that entails.
I wanted to also ask you about gang rape. So in June, I read a very powerful New York Times article written by Vidya Krishnan, in which she asks, I don't understand gang rape. Is it some medieval desire to dominate and humiliate? Do these men with little power over others, feeling inadequate and ordinary, need a rush of power for a few minutes? So these are questions that many women have. And with the framework in mind, I would like to revisit, even if it's hard to do, the brutal gang rape of Jyoti Singh in 2012. So, as you know, Jyoti Singh was a young middle-class woman, a physiotherapist student living in Delhi. She boarded a bus after watching a film with a male friend, and she was gang raped, tortured, disemboweled, and thrown off a moving bus. And she died from her injuries. One of the rapists was interviewed, and he said, if the women are not good, men have the right to teach them a lesson by raping them. He also said a girl is far more responsible for rape than a boy, and that if she was a good woman, she would not have been roaming the streets at 9 o'clock at night. So what does the framework help us understand here?
I think that harrowing as these events are, and they are so harrowing and so difficult to look at square in the eye, as it were, there are really two aspects of them that we can separate out. So one is the way boys and men often posture for each other in groups of men. There's a lot of hand-wringing about how boys and men don't show their emotions, and a lot of it is not very empirically backed. Boys and men do tend to show their emotions, but they tend to show them to women who are then expected to kind of minister to these emotions, but they don't tend to show things like softness and sadness and those kinds of emotions to and among groups of other men. There can be a lot of posturing and violent behavior and sort of out-alphaing each other in groups of men that I think is a really disturbing and consistent feature of patriarchy. And I think the other part of it, the very obvious part of it, is the gross brutality to which women are subject when they're perceived as quote-unquote not good by patriarchal standards. So yeah, it's really striking that, at least according to their words, they felt they were justified in this behavior. They felt that they were morally righteous and teaching her a lesson and on the side of right in this just viciously, disgustingly immoral behavior.
During the course of our discussion about violence against women, we also talked about patriarchy and how it is just not dealt with head-on. I've read lots of papers written by academics, by the World Bank, by the UN, by the Indian government, about, what are the root causes of violence against women? And the issues, I'll just read out a few of them that keep repeating themselves. So one is gender discrimination is an issue, inadequate education, lack of fear of law and punishment, pornographic addiction, drug usage, TV and entertainment, crowded living conditions, financial insecurity. But even when there is talk about a patriarchal system or social norms and expectations, there isn't deep discussion about it. Why isn't patriarchy talked about more? Why do we think that is?
It's a good question. I think the notion has somewhat fallen out of favor. It's seen as somewhat old-fashioned. It's seen that we're past this. And we're just not. We're just not. I think it's still a really helpful theoretical tool. And yeah, one of the main reasons that I was, so keen to loop Erna into this important conversation with you, Shana, is that she has really studied in great depth Brahmanical patriarchy in, the very different social context. And, I wonder too if, Erna, you can speak to ways in which it is a useful concept in ways that I think it's just of a piece with a tendency to underestimate how much feminist analyses matter and also how quickly we can move on to the next feminist analysis, because we have these ideas of waves of feminism and we're leaving behind the feminism of the past. And my own 2 cents on this is that we don't speak about waves of any other kind of political thought. We regard ourselves as building on the insights of others, not as moving past them. So I actually think there might be a piece of misogyny in this idea that feminist thinking of, say, the 70s that did really emphasize the notion of patriarchy, along with older scholarship, is somehow obsolete when it's just not.
I totally agree with that. And speaking to Brahmanical patriarchy, I feel like one of the reasons that very few people would cite that as the reason that things are as they are when it comes to women's suffering is that calling out caste is just basically kicking a hornet's nest. Caste is the system by which wealth is organized in Indian society, by which basically different kinds of capital are organized and how different kinds of capital have flowed across generations. I think it just serves the interests of the upper caste cis men who are in power to pretend that the violence that women face is a result of individuals who are suffering from the conditions that they've laid out in that list, instead of pointing to how institutions sanction this sort of violence and have for many, many years.
Similarly, one of the other things I've seen with a lot of academic papers, again, things coming out of World Bank and UN, is that when you look at birth control and papers that are written about contraception, it always talks about it in terms of it being something that is a woman's responsibility. And I think it's interesting because the work that you're doing has helped me to understand, well, why are they always looking at it as a woman's responsibility? What is the kind of patriarchal thinking there? In the Indian or in the South Asian context, often the thinking is, well, the woman will have another child and it'll be another child for her to take care of.
And to that, I'll also say there's some ideas regarding men's nature and women's nature here that are prominently in play. Men are not expected to control their sexual behavior while women are. There's the idea that men cannot, in fact, control their sexual nature, while women, due to norms of chastity, and also due to what you just said, of caring for the child is primarily their responsibility, they're expected to be more on top of things like contraception.
Orna, that's such a good point. I guess it feeds into that sense of entitlement of how a man might believe that he can satisfy his urges without a woman's consent. So, Kate, you delve into these issues and you dedicate your life to this work. You study incels, you study medical discrimination that impacts women, also trans women, and you stare down the barrel of trolls who go after fat women.
Yeah, I think in some ways there is a lot of guilt and shame around looking at these phenomena very seriously and soberly and not making excuses for men who are perpetrators within these social systems. And refusing to kind of do the theoretical emotional labor of giving these men something of a pass when it comes to behavior that is inexcusable and terrible. And I do think often makes a kind of sense, but according to logics that are themselves incredibly retrograde and rather easily seen to be deeply unjust. So, yeah, I suppose that I just have a certain amount of attraction to trying to look at all of it squarely and seriously and not kind of find, a ironic angle or a tongue-in-cheek angle or look away from it, but just like, what would actually happen if we took all of this really, really freaking seriously? Because it matters. It matters to girls and women. And I felt like tempted to do the opposite of what I felt social pressure to do, which was to somehow go for a curlier line on this, or somehow change the topic to poor old boys and men, or somehow, end up actually criticizing women and feminists predominantly. So I guess I've tried to resist those pressures that I think are of a piece, actually, with patriarchy. Not to say there aren't very important criticisms of women and feminists, especially white women and white feminism, to be made, but I do think it's good to have some of us most focused on patriarchy and its intersections with racism and homophobia and transphobia and fatphobia and ableism. So yeah, that's been kind of my jam for a while.
At what point in your life did you say to yourself, I am a feminist?
I don't remember ever not identifying as a feminist since I understood some of the injustice women face. Like, I must have been a very humorless 10-year-old, I say jokingly, because of course feminists are not in fact humorless, but we are perceived that way. And I'm sure that's the way I was perceived when I did my little, primary school project in Australia at age 10 on the history of feminism. So yeah, there was no big aha moment for me. It's just kind of been a constant, partly because my parents raised me to be aware of these injustices, to their great credit, along with racism and anti-indigeneity and anti-refugee sentiment, which my family has always been very invested in resisting and, educating us as children about, my sister and I. So I'm very grateful to them for, we are a very social justice oriented family.
And Urna, for you, did you have a moment in your life where you thought, I'm a feminist, or were you also like Kate, privileged enough to have a family that believed in it and was eager to help you learn about it?
I think that for a long time, I operated with the naive conception of misogyny, as Kate calls it. To my mind, I used to think it was individuals who treated men wrongly for reasons that were peculiar to them, and individual women who were treated wrongly, right? And given that calling oneself a feminist can only really come with an appreciation of the systematic character of these wrongs, I think I'd like to say that I started calling myself a feminist in my freshman year of college, probably, when I took a class on feminist theory. And that led me to appreciate the systematic character of the violence that's visited upon women and also other marginalized genders.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Shanna.
Thank you. What a great conversation.
Kate and Urna give us insight. They help us decode why crimes against women are part of a much bigger systemic problem. Seeing the logic of misogyny is, I think, something worth considering. Imagine what would happen if governments, World Bank, UN finally got serious and said, yes, women are under threat, online and on the streets, and that this is a systemic problem requiring national task forces and intervention and money backing it. Anything less, and what are we saying? That all these crimes against women are just the way things are? Our natural state of existence? I'm your host, Shauna. If you want to get in touch with us and rage or have a good cry, or just tell us what you're thinking, look for our webpage, because we have one now, or find us on Instagram. Until next week.